Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kentucky Small Business Development Center's weekly webinar. We're glad you're here today. As we allow attendees a few moments to join our event, we'd like to share some info about the Kentucky SBDC. As a statewide nationally accredited program that provides entrepreneurial and business development services, the Kentucky SBDC plays a vital role in the Commonwealth's economic development by assisting entrepreneurs at every stage of their business life cycle. For almost 40 years now, the Kentucky SBDC has assisted emerging and growing businesses by providing the professional expertise, tools, and information necessary to make sound business decisions in a complex and ever-changing marketplace. So we do this at no cost to our clients. That's thanks to the U.S. Small Business Administration, who co-sponsors our program, which is then administered by the University of Kentucky, who also partners with the regional universities, colleges, and local economic development agencies. We're part of a national network, as you see on the screen, America's SBDC, with over 1,000 centers across the nation. You can learn more about us at kybizhelp.com. There you'll find additional resources to help start, fund, and grow your business. To request personal assistance, you can email us at info@kybizhelp.com or call us on our hotline at 888-475-7232. As always, a recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you later this afternoon. So if you have a problem with the broadcast, or if you just need to step away, know you'll have access to the entire recording. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll find our chat feature. If you have any questions for our presenter, you can post them here and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. But if you want to go ahead and check that out, you go ahead and type and tell us where you're joining us from today. So what part of the state or outside of the state of Kentucky that you're joining us from. I'm Janet Flaw with the Louisville Center, which is one of 13 centers throughout the Commonwealth. And with me today are my colleagues from the Louisville Center, Dave Etkin, our Center Director, and Tony Sears, our Assistant Center Director. Good afternoon, folks.
Good afternoon, Janet. Good to see you again.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I am so excited about today's subject matter because we're going to be talking about podcasts. And I love them. I listen to them all the time. I have podcasts that I listen to on motivation. I even have one on like sleep meditation to help me get it to sleep at night. So I'm going to really enjoy this. So I'll turn it over to you.
Just like you, Janet, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I tend to drive a lot, and I have a bunch of them on my phone, and I use them widely in the car. So yeah, they're part of my life as well. So yeah, I too am super excited about this. Rob Simon, our guest today, he's an early pioneer in podcasting. He's one of the first people that launched a bunch of different podcasts early on, and he founded Burst Marketing in 2004 as a podcasting agency to help other people develop their podcasts through all stages from production to tracking. He's also an innovative podcasting media and marketing executive who combines social and digital media expertise coupled with traditional and integrated marketing strategy as part of Burst Marketing. He's also developed and managed innovative streaming platforms for Publishers Weekly and also the Colorado Classic Pro Bicycle Race. He's also started a digital-first publishing imprint, an integrated marketing and public relations agency, and several other disruptive media companies in the cable TV, magazine, and newspaper industry. So like me, I'm going to have a ton of questions. So as you have questions, please jot those down and put them in the chat. And we'll get through and ask as many questions as we have time for today. So let's everyone welcome Rob. And if you're on the chat, tell us where you're from and what you hope to get out of today, and we'll hopefully get things covered for you today. So, Rob Simon, how are you today? You're in Denver, Colorado, where the weather is probably spectacular.
Yeah, great, thank you. No, the weather is great here. Colorado has some wonderful weather, and September is our best month. So I'm excited to be on this presentation and excited to be in Colorado.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's get started and not hold back too long.
Okay. Great. So today, the title is How to Start a Podcast to Market Your Business. And So what you'll learn today is I'll give you some vital stats on why podcasting and why you should be looking at it as a business if you don't know already. I'm going to give you some of the tips and pointers about how to create, produce, distribute, promote, and track your podcast, and also some best practices for businesses and tips along the way. Okay. And as Dave said, feel free to text in your questions on the chat, and then we'll assemble them, and I'll be glad to answer as many as we can during this presentation, if I haven't answered them already. So I guess the first question is, why should a business produce a podcast? Well, I'll let Forbes magazine answer that. And they're basically saying your customers are listening to and being influenced every day by what they hear on podcasts. So ensure that you're one of the voices that they are hearing. And so why is that? I mean, why is it that everybody seems to be listening to podcasts? Well, you're watching the rise of a powerful new medium. And I'm going to share with you some statistics that will show you why this is becoming such a powerful new medium for businesses. First of all, let's not forget that podcasting didn't start just a few days ago. It started in 2001. Well, basically, the iPod came out in 2001, and that was a disruptive technology back then, the idea of having MP3 files on a small little device. And then the first podcast came out in 2004. A guy named Adam Curry used to be a disc jockey for MTV, had sort of this idea and thought, wow, if I can get an MP3 onto a little device like that, I can kind of make that kind of like a radio show. So he theoretically coined the word podcasting. And then that became an accepted word in the dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, back in 2005. And then we started Burst Marketing, which at that time had been sort of providing full service marketing and focused almost exclusively on podcasting back around 2005. And the reason why was when I saw what a podcast could do, I got the aha moment because my background was in traditional print publishing, newspapers and magazines and books, and it's expensive to get the word out and get heard when you have to print something and publish something on print and newspapers and distribute it. And so when I saw that a podcast could push out your story digitally for free to people around the country, around the world, and you don't have to pay anything in terms of distribution. There's no ink, there's no paper. I go, aha, this is great. And even though I didn't have a radio background or an audio background, I saw the power of this medium to actually, get your story out. So that was back in 2005, and I did launch a couple of podcasts back then, 2 or 3, and 2 of them are still running, making them some of the longest running podcasts probably on iTunes and in history. But I probably spent the first 10 years of my business teaching people, businesses, what podcasting meant, or even what an iPod was at one point. So I did a lot of evangelical selling during those days. So let's kind of track the growth, because it's been meteoric over the last few years. So now we have 75% of America familiar with what podcasting is. And when I got started, I would probably say it was, they say in this chart it was 22%, but it was probably more like 5%. So 212 million people at least know what podcasting is and what it can do. At least more than half of the USA has listened to a podcast. So not only do they know what it is, they've actually done it. So that's 155 million people. And then at the same time, the number of listeners is growing astronomically. So Nielsen has said now that 37% of the USA is listening to a podcast monthly. So that's an amazing statistic. And then by 2023, which is just a couple of years, that number will double. So imagine 75% of the USA listening to podcasts on an ongoing basis, on a monthly basis. And so that's also spurred an increase in the growth of content. So basically, we're seeing hundreds and thousands of people launching podcasts, especially during the pandemic. People want to talk and they want to listen. So right now there are about 1 million podcasts on iTunes, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But compared to blogs and YouTube videos, we still have a long way to go. But you can see that it's growing exponentially, because in 2018, we had 500,000 podcasts. So there's a lot of content out there that can be found and can be listened to. So that's also something that a business needs to be aware of, because not only other businesses putting content out there, you've got individuals, you've got groups, you have nonprofits, you have governments. So there's a lot of stuff. And so you step back and you say, well, why? What's happening all of a sudden that didn't happen, 14 or 15 years ago? Well, as you can see by a lot of these devices, the growth is being spurred by this new connected world that we live in. So we have smartphones, which have something like 90% penetration in the US. We have smart speakers like Alexa. We have connected cars. So people are connected digitally to devices more than they ever have been. And so that has released the power of audio and voice to both command action, but also to deliver content. And so people can listen, to what they want to listen to on any device, anywhere, anytime, while they're working out, while they're driving, commuting, while they're riding their bikes, while they're talking to other people. So those devices and audio has been is especially powerful during this time because it's perfect for multitasking. With video, demands 100% attention like this webinar, but audio you can do in the background while you're doing something else. So it's becoming more popular the more connected we are. And as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has accelerated this growth. People are home, people are looking for new information and new content. And then even though they are not commuting as much as they used to and not listening to their car, they're shifting where they're listening to things. So people have, I've been reading now that people are now doing quote, fake commutes. So they may get up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and instead of getting in their car, they're going someplace or going into a room and putting on their favorite podcasts so they can get back to listening to what they used to listen to when they were commuting. So everybody wants to start one. Everybody is listening. Matter of fact, so popular is it right now that if you were to try and buy some of the better microphones and headphones on Amazon or some of the audio sites, they're all sold out. So for some of our clients who have been recommending certain gear, we've had to have plan B, plan C, and plan D because of the popularity of the gear and stuff. So you may ask, okay, that's great, but who's listening? And is it right for businesses? The prime listeners are between 25 and 54 years old, so they're 63% of the audience. So that's a great consumer and buying power group. It's actually reaching the millennials too, which have been hard to reach. Those 18 to 24, they're almost 20% of the audience. Pretty even split, 52% male, 48% female. And as you might expect, almost 100% are listening on their smartphone. 97%. So Apple has got the lion's share, and then Android, Google devices follows up shortly thereafter. But for businesses, we're finding that there's a little bit of a different spread. So for example, a lot of people who are listening to business podcasts are listening to them also on their computers while they're doing work or while they're at the office when they were at the office. So you'll see a shift away from the smartphone, and also maybe it's like 75% on smartphones, and you're having 25% on tablets and on PCs and laptops. So why should a business pursue doing a podcast? Well, first, I think the most important thing is that a podcast is what we call permission-based engagement. The consumer, the user, the listener, has to subscribe or download or click or do something to actively listen to a podcast. So when they do that, it's because they want to. So they are engaged from day one. They're not being served an ad. It's not a pop-up, one of those annoying things that you have to keep finding on the internet these days. It's not an email that you have to open up. It's something that you are choosing to listen to. And so because of that, it creates a sort of special personal relationship with the medium, because since you've chosen it, you're listening to it, you're more invested in it. And having something in your head like this, in the earphones, is also very powerful. It creates sort of an intimacy and investment in the media that doesn't happen with other kinds of mediums, which is why, and this is the one shock of all the things that I've said so far, this is the one that continues to shock me, which is that 80% of the people who listen to a podcast listen to almost the entire episode. And so when you think about it, in terms of the short attention span that we're now living with, that's pretty phenomenal. And podcasts can range from 5 minutes to, some of them are an hour and a half. And that drives me crazy, an hour and a half podcast. But a lot of people are sticking through the whole thing. And it's because they've chosen, they're engaged, it's their show because they decided to be a listener. And so they're more invested in staying through it. Moreover, podcasting is attracting, a prime audience. As I mentioned by the statistics, But in terms of demographics, they tend to be wealthier, more educated consumers, which is always good for a business. And finally, one of the most important things too is that you can control the narrative. It's your story that you're telling, no matter how you're telling it on your podcast. And also, as Forbes had said, be aware, because if you're not doing it, your competition already is. So you need to be out there in the space as well. And I know we probably have businesses of all sizes on our webinar. So hello to everybody, from the small business to the big brand to the entrepreneurs and the startups that KSBDC is helping, to high-tech companies and no-tech companies. We've worked with any businesses. We've worked with cybersecurity companies, medical companies, acupuncture companies, actually, car repair, sports, recreation, food. It's really right for any kind of business as long as you have a story to tell. And it's been great for business too. If you look at the Nielsen report on what people are listening to in terms of genres, business is the fourth most popular genre. So that's ahead of news, comedy, arts, sports. So if you think about that, that's a kind of an incredible thing, because this is a dirty little secret, but I listen to podcasts for comedy. So, and maybe some news, but again, more people are listening into for business. So that's great news for businesses of any size. So how do you use it if you're a business? Well, you can use it to show your thought leadership. So if you're a technology company and you're doing some pioneering work in medicine or data, you can be using it to showcase how you're thinking about that. If you're a retail company, you can be talking about customer stories and talking about your product, but not in a promotional way, but in a fun way where people can sort of share and discuss and say what makes your product great. Or you can go behind the scenes. We're working with one company that grows organic eggs, and we were interviewing the chickens for a podcast because we wanted to, in a humorous way, show how organic and how clean they were in terms of how they developed their eggs. And if you're a B2B company, you might be interviewing your partners or your clients or subject matter experts to provide insights about what your product or what your service can do for people. And so I'm going to walk you through, and there's going to be a lot of information here, so I'll be open for questions. You'll see my email pop up a couple of times so that you could email me after the fact. If you have a question, I'd be glad to talk to you on the phone and arrange sort of a free consult at some point to help you figure out what you should do, if you should do, and where you should look to either create or to advance a podcast you may already have, because some of you may already have one that you want to start to advance and improve. So I'm going to walk you through the 5 steps that we do as a podcasting agency. And any podcaster who's doing this for their business will have to kind of go through these 5 steps. It's just a question of whether you're doing it all yourself or whether you're having somebody help and guide you along the way. And that's what we do, but I'm going to give you some of our tips and some of our steps so that you can do that for yourself or find somebody who can help you do that. So the first one is to actually create the podcast. And by that, I mean, what is the concept? What is the show? Are you trying to do something where you're talking about customer stories, or is it going to be a thought leadership show where your CEO is talking about the things that make your company great? Is it going to be a question and answer show where you get people calling in and leaving voicemails, and then you're answering questions? Or is it going to be a news show where you're talking about news in the industry? For example, we have one cybersecurity podcast that we're launching where they're doing 5 minutes in 5 headlines in 5 minutes, where they're reading stuff that's important to people in the industry, not about their company, but about trends. And so they're just giving a quick digest of things that people can use. So we help you create what that concept would be, what we think would work best. And then what's the format? Is this something that's going to be a 10-minute show, 15-minute show? You're going to do it once a week? Are you going to do it once a month or twice a month? So we have recommendations about how often you should be doing that. For businesses, for example, we think that you should be doing at least twice a month. And once a month, people tend to forget. But think about it like a magazine, which is that if people learn to see a magazine or a paper come out at a certain time, that's what they want from your podcast. People often ask me what the ideal length of a podcast could be. The beauty is that a podcast could be as long as it needs to be, but I think the sweet spot is if you're doing an interview show, somewhere about 20 or 25 minutes is great. But some shows can go longer, some shows can go shorter. So it really depends upon the content. And then one of the things that you have to do as part of this creative thought part is, okay, you've got your concept, you know what your show's going to be about, then what are you going to call it? What's the name? It has to be something memorable, something that says what it's about. You then have to create the cover art. I'll talk more about that, which is, think about it, the podcast cover or the podcast logo. It's what people see on their iPhones, on iTunes. Every place your podcast goes, this is what sells and tells people what they're listening to. So it's a really important part of your brand, especially since you will be using that on social media and across multiple platforms. Decisions you have to make, are you going to be the talent, or is somebody in your company going to be the talent? Are you going to have co-hosts? You don't have to be a radio star to put on a great podcast. As a matter of fact, that's the power of this. Most of the people who are doing podcasts have never been on radio or have had any experience before. So there are things you can do, gear you can buy, and tips that we can give you that can help you become a better host if you're going to be the host. But we also have pros that we use to host shows where there is no host available at the business. We tend to use NPR as, quote, the gold standard. And what we like about NPR and their radio show, either their radio show or their podcast hosts, is that they're average regular people who are journalists, but they just happen to talk well on radio. So it's that kind of conversational voice that we're looking for. And that is not a radio voice where you sound like a disc jockey, but that's going to be more about just talking to people through these headphones in a way that they feel like they're being talked to and not boring them. As part of the creative part at the beginning, you should have a branded intro and outro. By that I mean, 5 or 10 seconds that explains what your podcast is about, with some signature music, royalty-free music, so that people begin to associate that with your podcast. It makes it sound more professional, and then you'll be finding you can use that music to signal breaks in your podcast or to change the mood. So that becomes an important part of the creation process. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this next bullet, which is where do you actually host your podcast? And by hosting it, I mean, where do those MP3 podcast files reside? Where does the information about each show reside? And there's two choices you can make. One is to have that done by a third party, and there are several great third-party companies out there like Podbean or Blueberry and Libsyn and Buzzsprout. You may have heard of some of these names. Or the other way that you can do it is by doing it on a page and on a platform that is off your website. And I'll show you here what I mean by that. So if you're a business, you can actually set up a podcast page on your website that could be like business.com/podcast or podcast, /business.com. And then this is where you'd be uploading all your episodes, where you'd be posting the titles and the show notes about what the episode is about. It's where you would be having any kind of archives or searches for your podcast. And that's the example on the left here. This is something we did for a writing podcast called Right Minded. And one of the major benefits of this is that you control the experience and the customer journey if you have it coming off your page. Because now every time people come to subscribe to the podcast, or look for information, or actually even anytime somebody downloads a file, that file is coming from your website, from your URL. So that's a big gain in terms of SEO, but also in keeping people on your site for your experience. And on the lower right-hand corner, this is a random podcast from a company that is hosting it called Libsyn, which is one of the first podcast hosting companies, and they do a really good job of getting somebody to put your podcast up, have it, some of them also enable you to record it, on their site, but at least get sort of the cover art and get the episode up. So that's a great way to go for a lot of people who are do-it-yourselfers. But again, as I said, it's now living there. And so at some point, if you have a website or a blog or social media, you have to then direct people toward this Libsyn site for listening, as opposed to directing people toward your site for listening. So you can see that's a big strategic change. Also, when you have it on your site, you can do more things to it. You can add PDFs to your podcast. If you want people to download something, you can add transcripts. You have information on how to subscribe if people are new. You have some search options. So you can do much more, or keep it as simple as you want to. But again, you're the master and manager of that whole podcast domain. One of the big things is, as I said, there's 1 million podcasts now on iTunes. So how do you stand out? And one of the ways to stand out is creating powerful cover art. These are these little squares that define your podcast. One of the biggest mistakes is many people who are designers design it looking at a big computer, but sometimes they get really small on your phone. So they have to work really small. So we tell people that if you're going to design big, but then shrink it down to something that is very, very tiny, like 55 by 55, so you can see where it might look like when it shows up on a phone, or even a small phone, or on some of the directories that have these little thumbnails. So we have, since this is one of the most important things and foundations that you do, we have developed sort of our 9 cover art tips and specs, sort of what we think are the keys to making great cover art. So how do you make it work on Apple, which is the 800-pound gorilla. If it works on Apple, it'll work everywhere. So you have to have it available in multiple different sizes. And how do you best communicate the subject? How do you stand out? How do you follow the bold and simple rule? If you're a company and you have a podcast name and you have your own logo, how do you do that so that you don't compete with your podcast logo? How many words should be on a podcast cover? There's a rule of thumb. What fonts you should and shouldn't use, and which images you should avoid and should use. And then how do you repurpose it so it works on all platforms? And so I just put, this is not our podcast, but I just put this one up because I thought it's a good example of a cover art that conveys what it's about. So it's about happiness, and it's got a little smiley. We can read the name, and it's done by a company called Pushkin. So you see the company logo, one color, basically 2 fonts. So it's a strong cover art and a great example. So if you would like, there's a lot to go over in this, and so instead of boring everybody during this webinar, if you email me, I will send you a PDF that has these specs and tips and secrets to how to great cover art. And don't worry if you don't have time to write this down right now. My email address will be up at the end too, and of course it'll be on the recorded part of the webinar as well. So that's rob@burstmarketing.com, and you can always email me and I'll send that to you. And then as you see, this is one of our podcasts we're doing about unstoppable athletes. Once you have your cover art, you're going to repurpose it across all your channels. So on the right-hand corner, we have the website. We have it on Instagram. We have it as it shows up on a phone, during a podcast, on Twitter, and on Facebook. So your cover art becomes important not only for how it works on your podcast, but also how it works across all your communications channels. And as a business, that kind of branding and consistency is very important. And it's also great for discovery and also for people to fall in love and stay loyal to your podcast. Okay, so that's getting it launched. Now, how do you produce it? Well, of course, you have to have the right gear, and the right gear is not expensive and not complicated. It's going to be a headphone and a microphone, and I'm going to show you a couple of options there. We use remote recording software so that people can, and we always actually have been. So even before the pandemic, we've always been using software that operates off computers so that people can be in several different places, the guests, the hosts, and us as engineers and recorders, so that we can get the best quality audio sound. It used to be that we had to have digital recorders and be physically in the same place, but the world has changed, and now we can do that remotely, and it's a lot more efficient, especially if you're interviewing guests that could be around the country. We have tips for how to do that, and training so that you get to the place where you get that conversational voice and how to interview people. One trick on the interviewing is that very often our hosts know more than the guests and actually know the answers. And so you actually, if you're going to be a host, you actually have to dumb yourself down and ask questions that you already know the answers to, and in a way that don't give away the answers. We had one podcast where the host was so smart that she was asking the question with so much information, by the time the guest got to answer, all they could say was, yeah, you're right. So there was a terrible interview. So we had to teach her how to stop being so smart. We also recommend that you can be doing and recording these things in batches. I know time is an issue and for everybody, and your guests as well. So sometimes we have set aside recording afternoons or mornings where we say, okay, we're going to record for this podcast 3 episodes, Thursday from 10 to 11 or 10 to 12. So it's great for us in terms of scheduling our production part, but also for your show, because you can maybe record a month's worth of podcasts in 1 hour. So in terms of the time suck, it doesn't have to be great if you do this batch recording approach. Once we record the podcast, they need to be post-produced and edited. People will do a lot of ums, as I'm doing right now, and you can take those out. Sometimes people make an answer and they want to change it, or they've said it wrong, or they stumble. So the beauty of podcasting is that it isn't live. It's appointment content. People are going to download it when they want to listen to it, not when you think they want to listen to it. So because of that, you have the ability to, in this live interview that you're doing with your guests, retake questions, cut down long-winded answers so that you really get to the core of a great show. So that post-production is important too. And then also there's some technical stuff that we also do where you adjust the sound to make sure that everybody sort of had the same sound levels. And so it sounds like a more produced radio show. If you have a sponsor or some commercials, you can cut those in. That branded intro and outro I talked about, you edit that in. And so it's not hard. It's just that somebody has to be paying attention to the post-production. And then one of the things that people forget that you need to do is you write the show notes, which is what's this podcast about? Because when you post it, you need 50 to 75 words to say, hey, in this episode, we talked to XYZ about ABC. Not difficult, but I think about it as clickbait. The show notes might be a sentence or two that get people interested to your podcast, but don't reveal everything it's talking about. We always recommend at the beginning that you produce a pilot and a trailer so that you get used to this, as well as have something that you can use as a promotional tool to tell people about your podcast. And then, of course, once you have all that together and you have your edited file and you have your show notes, then you have to post it onto your podcast page or your podcast hosting company. So that's just like posting a blog post or something, or an email post. So it's not difficult, but it's part of the workflow. As I told you earlier, I said I might talk to you about gear. Basically, you're going to need a microphone, and we recommend a cardioid, which means that it's more focused, doesn't grab everything in the room. Shure, Audio-Technica, and Blue Yeti make some of the more popular ones. You do want one that is a USB-based microphone because you want it to be able to plug right into your USB port of your computer. Some people actually even use their iPads. And if you have an iPad, a USB adapter, that can work, but computers are better. Pop filter is that little screen that prevents people from making their P's and their other things sound like it's going to zap the microphone. A stand, it can either be a boom stand like that crane or a stand on your desk. And then headphones so that you don't create echo. You can pull together some gear between $150 and $350 if you go on Amazon. You'll see all kinds of podcasting packages now, and the ones that are available are going to be kind of in that price range. And when it's set up, it looks pretty simple. And just having that mic in a consistent place in front of you, and then you're off to being a podcaster. Then you've created it, you've started to produce it, now you have to distribute it. And so by that, I mean, how do you get your podcast onto all the portals where people find, and apps where people find their podcasts? Okay, so first of all, either your website that we were helping you set up or these other third-party services are creating this RSS podcast feed that you then submit to these different portals. And so the way that you do that is first you need to validate the feed to make sure that it's compliant. And if you're doing things right at the beginning, then that should be no problem. Then you have to, one of the things you have to do is important is you have to select the right category for what your podcast is. So is it in the news section of iTunes, or is it in the entertainment section? Or if it's in news, is it business news, is it tech news, or is it medical news? So there are about 90 different categories and subcategories, and you need to pick your top 3. And that's important because that's where your competition is, but it's also where you want to stand out. So if you're a sports podcast, you don't want to be in the technology department because you'll never be found. This is how people find podcasts. So it's an important decision to make early on. And then you have to submit it to the top portals. There are probably about 15 to 20 different apps and portals that we distribute our podcast to. But some of the top ones are, of course, Apple and Google. They probably have between them something like 80% of the market. Spotify is becoming increasingly important, Stitcher, Castbox, and then some people subscribe just by the RSS feed. And since this is a business podcast, we also recommend, I want to make sure that people can listen to it on your website. So if they don't want to actually download it as a podcast, there's a play button that they can hit on the podcast. And so they can do it right from their computer right there. Also, we recommend a subscribe by email component where people can get email alerts every time there's a new episode. And that takes the people back to your website where they can play and listen to the podcast there as well. So giving people options is what you want, and being everywhere people find their podcasts is what you want. And for example, if you want to be on smart speakers, you have to be in one of these distribution portals called TuneIn, which is what Alexa uses. So if you want to say, hey, Alexa, play Rob's podcast, you need to be in TuneIn, and that's something that we can do. Now, you got a podcast, you're producing it, it's in all the popular portals. How do you promote it? How do you get people to listen? Hardest thing of all the things we've talked about so far, this may be the hardest. So the first thing is you want to launch your podcast right, and you want to have a launch campaign. And one of the goals here is to get your podcast to be noticed by these podcast portals and get put into what's called the new and noteworthy section. So, for example, when you launch a podcast, if in the first 8 weeks you're getting hundreds or thousands of downloads, which would be great, and people are writing 5-star reviews, fantastic podcasts, and they are subscribing to it. Apple and Google and most of these podcast portals have algorithms that notice that. And then if they notice that, guess what they do? They say, hey, this podcast is new and noteworthy, and they start promoting it. So that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more popular you are, the more popular they make you. So we recommend that you manage a launch campaign, give yourself time to plan it, maybe 6 weeks out. You can be building up buzz. You can say, hey, you can communicate to your audience, we're going to be launching our podcast on September 24th. Please come back, and when you do, subscribe, download, listen, and rate us, give us 5 stars. So you have this kind of coordinated campaign to launch it using all your social platforms. You may even do some paid advertising. And you also want to launch with at least 3 episodes and your trailer in place, because the more episodes you have up there, not the more, but if you have at least 3 or 4, then people can see that this is a real show. They can find something that they like. And then that also increases the downloads. So if somebody subscribes, now they're getting 4 podcast episodes, they're downloading and listening, and that's bumping up the algorithms. You don't want to launch too many because then it becomes overwhelming, but somewhere between 3 and 4 would be a great number to launch with. And you also obviously want to try and launch with your best content. And so if you're going to have guests, I would love to have some of your best guests on your first episodes. And I'm going to talk more about the importance of guests, because that's going to be the importance about audience. But again, that's sort of what we recommend for that launch campaign. And then once it's launched, continue to work your social media, get people to subscribe. You can even have a launch campaign. We can have sweepstakes and giveaways to get people to download and sign up and rate your podcast. And then here's the blocking and tackling. Once your podcast is up, then you have to manage your ongoing social media promotion. So if you have a podcast that's coming out every Wednesday, then maybe on Monday you start teasing and say, hey, check out our new episode that's coming out, and you'll learn X, Y, and Z. So you want to start preparing and teasing people for the upcoming episode. And then on episode day, if it's Wednesday, then you may have 2 posts or 1 that has a video or an audio clip, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute, so that you get people excited about the podcast. And then even after it's over, by over, I mean even after the day of that podcasting coming out, you still have days to keep telling people, hey, in case you missed it, check out this podcast. The other thing that we're finding too is that if you're working your social right, podcasts that you have in your archive episodes may have relevance when something happens in the news. So if you were doing something about a podcast about Apple Watches, for example, and you did an episode 3 months ago, and then today Apple announces a new watch, you may be able to repost information about that episode to get people really excited. So don't think that just once an episode has been aired that you can't promote it anymore. You still can. You can find Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups, and you can be following conversations on Twitter and all those different places. You can enter and you can tell people about episodes that are relevant, and that's how you get people to find and discover, download, and then share your podcasts. If you have guests, having them help to distribute and promote the podcast is one of the most important things you can do, because if they have good social media followings or they're influencers, this is how you're going to be bringing new people to your show. I mean, after a while, your social media are talking to the same people. So there's only so much you can do from the people that you know. So the more guests that you have, or the more social media influencers that you reach out to who recommend your show, this is where your growth is going to come from, because now you're reaching new people in new ways, and making it easy for them to do that by giving them basically copy and paste content, a URL, and a hashtag that they can be sending people to. That's exactly what we want. Another thing that we recommend for promotion is getting transcripts for each of your episodes. I mean, that's good too for the hearing impaired, so that people who cannot hear can also read your podcast. But if you have your transcript embedded on your post, again, on your website for each of your episodes, that creates the SEO because of all the content that's in there for driving people who might be looking for something about, how to make a widget. And then all of a sudden they find that you have a podcast on how to make that widget. So those transcripts are very important for that. And as I said, you can embed the transcript into the actual podcast post on your website, or you can create it as a PDF or a searchable PDF, so that, or as a searchable HTML page, so that people can find it. So recommend that as one of the best practices for how you promote your show and get good SEO, but also how you help people with hearing disability. So how do you promote on social? And as I said, you want to use all your platforms. We manage this podcast called We Are Unstoppable, where we talk about famous athletes who had some sort of trauma or disease or medical problem in their past that they've overcome to become who they are as athletes. And Joe, the great quarterback, had that horrible leg injury that everybody saw. So, we did a show with him. And so what we did is we created an audio preview. Now, ironically, it is difficult to put audio clips onto Twitter and onto Facebook. And so you have to convert them into video. So I'm going to show you a little video clip that we use, which is really an audio clip that we made to sort of tease the upcoming episode. So you may want to start in terms of your social media plan. Before the show comes, you may have on Monday put up a little placard like this and say, who is the greatest, most unstoppable athlete you've ever seen? And, we asked that of Joe, and before you can hear his answer, you have to download the podcast. So you don't give it away. You want to tease people to listen to the show. And have different images and different looks so people don't get tired. So I'm going to stop this for a second, and I'm going to show you this video.
With this pandemic, people say, oh, life's going to change. I don't think of the word of change. I think of this as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to look at your business. It's an opportunity to look at yourself. It's an opportunity to look at your relationship in your family. And if people stop and really think, we were all on remote control. We were all just moving along at the same speed, doing the same thing, committed to the same events every day, and just moved along. Now, all of a sudden, everything stopped. Now we have to step back and say, okay, where am I? What's going to be out there going forward?
UnstoppablePodcasts.com. Subscribe today.
Okay, so that was actually an audio clip that we then converted into this 25, 30-second video that we then posted on Facebook, on Twitter. We were able to boost it on Facebook and on Twitter too, so we can get to a larger audience. So we put some paid social to it. We gave it to our hosts and they put it out on their Twitter feeds. We also send it to Joe so that he could push it out. And so you can see how you can take that kind of clip to get people interested in hearing more about the show, and then download it, and then but also give a flavor of what the interview is about. So sometimes when we are doing our recording, we are also have as a side deal, we are doing a Zoom at the same time, and we are using the Zoom because often we found that when people are interviewing, that they like to see each other, even if we're not using the video for the actual show. But now some of the guests are giving us the permission to use that video, and we're going to be using some of those videos as clips to tease the actual audio podcast. There are some companies that and some podcasts that do the entire episode and turn it into a video, even a 30-minute video, and put it on YouTube so that people can, quote, listen to it on YouTube, even though it's just audio. So, for example, they just would put their logo up and then put 30 minutes of the audio. So that's an option if you have a robust YouTube channel of how do you then distribute your podcast onto YouTube, if that makes sense. Okay, now you're doing this, you're promoting it, how you doing? Okay, so you need to create a monthly dashboard, or it's good to have a monthly dashboard of how your podcast is doing. So that could include, if you've got a Google Analytics package, watching the traffic that's coming to your website and seeing how that's spiking or not spiking based upon the shows that are coming out. There are companies that provide some statistics that you can subscribe to that give you detailed information about your podcast, like downloads, listen time, platforms. iTunes and Google Podcasts and a couple of the other platforms each have some limited information about your podcast episodes and your show, like how many subscribers you have. But they only give very limited points of view. You want to try and find out globally how you're doing. How many subscribers do you have? Are you losing subscribers? How many downloads you're getting? What's the average listen time for each of your podcasts, shows? Are there certain shows that are doing better than others? So are people doing it on their phones or on their desktops? So you can get a lot of insights from tracking this. But you can also learn. So you can also find out, hey, my longer episodes are just not doing well, or my episodes where I don't have a guest just don't do well. So it gives you insights into how you can improve your podcast. And then if you are also then trying to have an ROI to show to your CMO or to show to yourself about why this is an investment I want to keep, the tracking is a way to show your growth. And it's also a way to, if you're going to be bringing in some sponsors, or have some partners who are a part of this and want to see how it's doing. It's a way to say, hey, look, we're getting 2,000 downloads a month, or we're getting, last month we saw subscribers increase by 15%. So it gives you a story to tell to partners and sponsors, people in your company as well. Which brings me to this next point, is who pays for this? Well, if you're a business, it's part of your marketing and communications or public relations budget. But there are ways that you can monetize it. And one way is to have a sponsorship. And that sponsorship could come from a trusted partner, somebody who already knows you. And you say, hey, we're going to start this podcast. We think you'd be a perfect presenting sponsor. And they may be able to be involved from day one, in which case they could get their name attached to the podcast. So it could be, in this case, and ours, we had this We Are Unstoppable. It's sponsored by the University of Colorado Medical Center, who is interested in promoting their healthcare. So they were using this podcast as a way to talk about injuries and trauma. And we interviewed some of their doctors on our shows, but we got them on before we even had our first episode. And they weren't looking to see how many downloads we had. They were looking for the public relations and partnership association more than they were looking for sheer numbers. If you're going to knock on the door and try and sell a sponsorship to somebody, those people are going to want to see numbers, and they're going to, it's going to take time for you to deliver those numbers. It may take 1 or 2 years before you have enough people listening to make somebody interested. And with business, one of the things that's important is that it's to set expectations. It's not going to be the number of listeners that you have, it's going to be the right listeners. So if you're in a cybersecurity company that specializes in some very specific part of how do you prevent shopping cart fraud, then maybe you want to have 1,000 people who are in that business be listening to your podcast. So you don't need 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people to have a successful podcast, or to find a sponsor who also wants to reach those same 1,000 people. So when you're thinking about it, don't think about gross numbers. Think about getting to the right people and showing that you are getting to the right people and that that's growing. So again, that sponsorship model is a very good one to help pay for the cost or some of the costs of your podcast. You could even sell some ads. So halfway through the show, you can do a little commercial that you would read that your production company would help you do. So if somebody doesn't want to pay for a full sponsorship, you could sell a $250 ad, or you could set your own price amount based upon what you think you could sell that for. You could do that at the beginning of the show. You could do what we call the mid-roll, which is halfway through where you take a break and say, hey, here's a word from our sponsor. Or you could do it at the end, or all three places. There are companies that do dynamic ad serving, and these are third-party companies, like a company like Blueberry, where they will actually insert ads into your podcast for you by other companies who are looking to advertise on podcasts. But they are looking for podcasts that are getting at least 2,000 downloads per episode, which is a lot. Just at the starting point, just to even consider you as a possible advertiser accepted podcast. Those tend to be more consumer-based podcasts because those are like true crime shows or comedy shows that may have wider audiences. So that's not something we see happening much with business podcasts. We see more of the sponsorship model or the self-inserted ads. And then there's a company called Patreon that some podcasts are using, where they're asking their subscribers to pay for the podcast by committing to a monthly fee, whether it's $5 a month or $25 a month. You have many different choices. But for that, as a subscriber to the podcast and to this Patreon thing, think of it more like a donation. They're getting access to something special too. They might get extra content, or they might get a gift or something. The same way that when you make a donation to a public radio station, you may get a perk. Patreon is providing that for digital media like podcasting. Okay, now I've been talking for about 45 minutes. How do you get all this done? It seems like a lot here, about probably ready to get out of this webinar and saying, this is crazy, I just wanted to start a podcast. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are sort of two models. One is the do-it-yourself model, and there are these third-party hosting companies that can simplify a lot of what I talked about, where you can go on Podbean or Buzzsprout or Libsyn or Radio Public or Blueberry, and then you can upload your show. You still have to record it. You still have to create the content. You still have to schedule it. You still have to do all that work. That doesn't disappear. But some of the technology will be easier for you if you do it this model. But there's nobody holding your hand. You're on your own. As I said, too, it's not living on your website. So you're losing a lot of the business relationship with your podcast that you would have if you did it under the second model, which is down below, where you might use an agency such as ours or a third-party production company who could help you build something on your website, install the software that you would need to build the RSS feed. They do all the technology, the recording, the editing, and basically leave you to worry about the stuff that's important, which is the content, and then promoting it and reaching your audience. So that's a good partnership between what agencies and podcast production companies do best and what you do best, which is your subject and your content and your audience. So that's a fundamental decision you would need to make if you're going to start a podcast. And as I said, there are pros and cons to each. The do-it-yourself is less expensive, of course, and the agency one will cost more. But again, you now have a partner. In the same way you have an agency help you build a website or help you do marketing, you have an agency helping you with your podcasting. So I'll be wrapping up here shortly and opening up for questions, but I'm just going to give you sort of our top best practices. One, patience. Podcasting is a new channel that you're setting up, so you really have to invest the time. There's no quick growth. There's no magic bullet. Once you start your show, your first episode may just get a couple hundred downloads, and it's going to grow slowly. And again, as I said, too, making sure that you have your expectations in line, which is that you're not going to get millions if you're a business podcast. You maybe going to get hundreds and thousands, and that's going to be good because that's who you need to be getting. We started a podcast back in 2005. Its first episode had 25 downloads. They were doing about 100 a month. Now it's up to 5,000, and it's been doing that, growing like this very slowly, but every week, podcast over podcast. It's now one of the largest, most popular business-to-business podcasts on publishing. But it takes time and patience. And you can't just start a podcast and say, oh, well, I'll try it for 3 months for my business and see how it goes. Yeah, you could do that, but that's not going to be a real test. I think you need to at least commit a year to see if this is going to work for you, and if this is going to be something that makes sense. Second best is, as I said at the very beginning, when you create, have clear goals and develop a clear concept. What's the premise of your show? What's the value or benefit for them? If all you're doing is talking about yourself, that's not a benefit to your listener. So you have to really find what is the sweet spot of their benefits. What are their pain points? What do they want to know? So if you're scraping information and news because they don't have the time to do that, if that's the value you're bringing, great. If you're providing answers to questions that they can't find any other resources for, that's your benefit. Third thing is choosing that format and then sticking with it. So if you say, I'm going to be doing an interview show and it's going to be 15 minutes long or 20 minutes long and it's going to come out every other Wednesday, then that's what you should do, because people learn to expect that, and then that becomes valuable to them because they begin to look for your show every other Wednesday or every other Thursday or whatever the day is of the week that you're going to be publishing. And as you saw earlier, integrate it with all that you're doing. It's not just a podcast, it's one of your communication channels. So, you need to be integrating on your website, your email campaigns, your social media, every place where you're already talking to people, tell them about your podcast, get them to subscribe and vice versa. So it's an integrated part of your communications. Quality is important. You need good equipment, doesn't have to spend a lot. They need to be edited. You don't have to do a lot, but they need to be tightened up. Music helps, those show notes that I talked about and the transcriptions, all those things make for a quality show. And then having your host, whether it's yourself or somebody in your company or a co-host, again, that all makes for quality. Having guests is a great way for business to expand your reach and reach new audiences. So whether it's subject matter experts, people with strong social followings or influence, customers, these are the people who are going to help promote your show and help you grow beyond the people you already know. And then finally, launching it right with your best episodes, your pilot, to build that 5-star momentum, getting people to rate your show, having a sweepstakes and ratings giveaway. These are the things with launching it right the first time. And then also practice, track, and learn. I mean, it takes time not only to build your audience, but you get better. The more you talk, the more you interview, the more you do, the better podcast host you become, the better your show becomes. So don't be afraid to fail. You will get better. That's the beauty of the podcast, is that you can do what you want. It's your show, and don't be afraid to make a mistake or say the wrong thing. First of all, you can always edit it out, but this is part of the learning. And then if you're tracking your statistics, you'll see where your audiences are coming from and what they're liking and what they're listening. So finally, don't be afraid. It's fun. Have fun with it. And if you're having fun, your audience will have fun and they'll learn things along the way. So that wraps it up. Again, that's my contact information. If you have anything you want to ask me, I'd be glad to give you a free consult after this. We'll set something up to talk. Again, if you want me to send you that cover art document, just put that in your subject or in your email, and I'll send it off to you as well. So thank you for this time. Good.
Well, that was awesome. I'm sure you're going to get a lot of response there. I was looking at some of the attendees. We have people from all over the country attending today: Texas, Montana, Idaho, Tennessee, Ohio. So this has been great. So thanks for that. I would like to ask a couple questions to kind of get going. We have a ton of questions in the chat, and then Tony will get to those as well. And,
okay.
But first off, a question that has popped up. You mentioned about using music for your podcast, and I know there's some issues with royalties and stuff. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, we subscribe to a couple of different audio companies that have royalty-free music that you can buy. So royalty free doesn't mean it's free. It just means that you don't have to pay beyond the one-time use of it. So you can buy an audio clip for between $29 and $49, and then you can use that as your signature music for as long as that podcast is running. And so that's the way that you can get around that. And that's really important because we are big believers in maintaining the intellectual property and copyright of anything that we're putting on a podcast, even clips. So you have to be careful there too. If you were playing something in the body of your podcast, that you would have the rights to and permission to use that as well.
Okay. And then I'm sorry, I'm kind of in the weeds on the technical thing, but you mentioned a couple times about having a transcription for the podcasts. How do you do that?
Well, there's a good company that we use. It's called Podscribe, Podscribe. And so what they do is you can upload your show, and then they use artificial intelligence. A lot of a lot of transcription services use that, but it'll transcribe your show and be about 80% accurate. And then what you do is you can go in and edit that transcript. You can pay them to edit it, so that if you don't have the time to do that, they do that for about $1 a minute or so. Mm-hmm. But I subscribe to them, and I'm finding that from most of our shows, they're better than 80%. They're more like 90%. So the editing doesn't have to take that much time to get it to be perfect. And then when the transcript is done, you can take the code for that transcript and embed it onto your website. As a matter of fact, I can show you. I'll share my screen here if I can. I'm going to show you what that looks like.
Okay.
Let's see.
So while you're doing that too.
Okay.
So you also, I'm kind of in the do-it-yourselfer range here. So if you mentioned the audio recording software, what's some good examples of that, and what's kind of the cost to do that, to get some of that, get it?
Okay, I'll get to that. We just see people are seeing my screen here.
Okay.
Are you seeing my screen yet?
Not yet, no.
Oh. Firefox is not letting me do it.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So I'll skip that. But so your question is?
The software that you would use to edit and record your podcast. What are some examples that somebody would look for? What's the cost? And is it hard to learn? No.
Well, we use a software called Zencastr, Zencastr. And that has, it's a similar platform to Zoom, but it's for audio only. Mm-hmm. And what's good about it is that all of the people who are on it are on different tracks. So that if you and I were interviewing each other, we would be on a different track, so that I could take your voice after the fact and take that file, and I could make changes just to your voice, and whether I need to increase the volume or take out an echo. And so having that separate track is really important for doing your recording remotely. So we typically would use Zencastr for recording the audio, and then also have people on Zoom at the same time so that they can see each other and while they're doing the interview. And even though Zoom may be recording the video and the audio, as I said, we never use the audio from Zoom, but we do use the video sometimes for doing some clips. So that seems to be a good best practices. There are a couple of one other service which we have not used much is a company called Squadcast, which does mix video and audio primarily for podcasting. So you have the ability to see and then also record the audio. So that works as well. So those are two good services, for how you can record it. And in a pinch you can use Zoom. Just know that you can't edit, because Zoom records both audio and video. Just know that if you're using Zoom, the quality of the audio isn't as good, and also the separation of the tracks isn't there. Right. And then for editing software, we use either GarageBand on the Mac, which is a pretty intuitive way of of editing audio. There's also a free software called Audacity, Audacity, and you can download Audacity for free. And it's a very easy to use audio editing software, and there you can find video tutorials where you could get up to speed in a couple hours on how to do some of the preliminary things of cutting things out. And it actually becomes kind of fun when you start to cut out some things and move people's voices around. You start to feel pretty powerful. So I've actually enjoyed audio editing.
That's great. Hey, Tony, how about a question from the chat?
Sure, Dave. Rob, I just wanted to let you know that Bridget says that you're giving some amazing information, and she says thank you for it. But the question that I have comes from Kevin. He says, is there any advantage to including video or publishing a video version in addition to the audio version?
Yeah, and it's funny that you asked that, Kevin, because we started off at the very beginning doing video podcasts, because in the early days of video podcasts and podcasting, you could do either audio or video, and you still can put video up, but I want to talk to you about benefits of each. First of all, the video files can become very large, so it could actually break your feed. So I tend to discourage people from doing video and adding video into their audio podcast feed, and not only for the fact that it's large, but it also disrupts the process. What people value in a podcast is they value being able to listen to it while they're doing something else. So if you put a video podcast, now all of a sudden you're commanding them and asking them to be watching something, and that's not how people are thinking about their podcasts. So even though there's technically you still have the capability of doing that, don't recommend it. Not many people are doing it. If you want to use video, I would prefer that and recommend that you put it on YouTube, so that you have another channel and where people are used to using and seeing video, of a way of multiplying your content. So you have one on your audio podcast and one on video. So for example, a very popular podcast by Lewis Howes, what he does is he has his audio podcast and then he has a video version of it. He actually records a video of him doing the audio podcast in the studio and then puts it up on YouTube. So this way you get 2 bites of the apple. So if you really want to have video as part of your ongoing strategy, record yourself, record your guests if you can, and make that your video post on your YouTube channels, and then do your audio part for your podcast.
Thank you.
That's true. It'd be kind of hard for me to drive watching a video podcast.
Wouldn't recommend it.
So Rodney wants to know, is there a particular day of the week that most people listen to their podcast?
Yeah, they're saying sort of the sweet spot is Wednesday and Thursday tend to be better days for publishing your podcast.
Okay. Now I've got a couple of questions here. We're dealing with what's a good length for a podcast? Like how many minutes, or is a good length?
The rule of thumb is that an interview show where you have a guest shouldn't go longer than 45 minutes. I think the sweet spot for any podcast is between 15 and 20. And so when I'm counseling our clients, I say, let's shoot for that sweet spot of 15 and 20. Will some go longer? Yeah. Some will go 25. Will some go shorter? That's okay. But 15 to 20 is really a sweet spot for what I think works. And I've listened to some comedy shows that can go on for 45 minutes, and if they're funny, great, I'll hang with it.
So I have a question here from Adam. He says, does the transcription service work with Buzzsprout?
Yes, it should. If you have your podcast hosted on Buzzsprout, what you can do is you can point Podscribe to the actual podcast feed, and they will automatically download the episode and do the transcript for you.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So one last question here that I have in the chat is, what do you think about uncensored podcasts?
I think that it depends upon your audience. So when you submit your podcast and what you want out of it, part of the beauty of podcasting is you can say what you want, right? There are no restrictions, except when you submit your podcast to iTunes in particular, which is Apple, which is the biggest, quote, gorilla and manager of podcasts, they ask you to rate your podcast, who it's for. And they also ask you, is it appropriate or inappropriate for children? And so if you have to be honest about that. So if you're going to be doing an X-rated podcast because there's cursing, or there's going to be subject matter that is going to be not suitable for kids, you need to make that clear when you post it. They will still accept your podcast, but they will limit who they show it to, so that or they will put a warning so that it's explicit, for example. The same way video games have those ratings. So if you are going to do it, be honest about it. Know that it'll limit your audience, but if you don't care, then that's fine. So that, again, what does it get you? Make sure that you're uncensored for the right reasons. If that makes sense.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a question, Rob. When you're working on your concept, what's some best practice on? And let me back up just a little bit. Is it best to like set up a format like it's always going to be an interview show, or is it what's the very first steps? Something that's not super creative. How would they get started? Kind of planning that out. Well,
what we've done this before with clients, where once you come up with a concept, or you start to come up with an idea whether we're going to do an interview show, and you say, well, I think I'm going to be the host, then we always recommend that we try and do a pilot, and get on a real guest or a fake guest or somebody from the company, and we record it. We go through all the motions. We do the introduction, and we see how it sounds and how it feels and how they feel, whether they feel comfortable with it. We had one client who started off thinking they were going to be doing an interview show. We did one, and we were all at the end of it saying, that was boring. So even though it was quote the concept that we had agreed on and thought it was going to work, we realized that the subject matter was so technical that we were losing our audience. So we pivoted, and that now podcast is going to be coming out now, where it's going to be called 5 and 5. And so it's going to, instead of having a long interview with one subject matter expert, it's going to be the top 5 headlines in the news that week, with some kind of back and forth discussion about it, and then moving on quickly. So again, it's providing the benefit and the value to the user, not what you want to say. And so when we flipped it around, that's when we realized we had the right concept. So we did a pilot there, and then that sounded great. And said, okay, this will be the format that we're going to stick with. And then we've been producing, in the first few shows, and it keeps getting better as the co-hosts get better with, how they relate and talk with each other.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Rob. That was awesome. That was a lot of information to digest. I mean, this is a lot bigger subject than I had anticipated, and I can see the value to have somebody like you as an expert on your side, to navigate all this stuff. So I appreciate you sharing your time with us today.
Okay.
Dave, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So I'm kind of curious, Rob, if you counsel your clients in producing a podcast in a way that typically when a business has a presence on a website or whatever sort of thing, that image of the business owner and what they're about is really, it's really constructed in a way so it's one message, or it has one type of branding. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think when folks, they might look to get onto a podcast, you end up speaking and revealing a lot more about your personality that may be harmful to your brand. I'm wondering if there's any kind of like counseling that goes in place at first that says, be mindful of what your brand is versus, what your freewheeling speech might end up, revealing about yourself.
Well, that's a difficult balance because on the one hand, if the people who are hosting the podcast or guests are from the company, we obviously do want them to stay on message for who they are, for their brand and for the company. But if they do that too much, then it sounds like a commercial for the company,
Right.
and you're going to lose your audience. So I tend to err on encouraging people to be themselves and to have fun and have more of their personality. And the nice thing about it too is when we're recording it, if they say something that they go, "Oh man, that was a big mistake," on a podcast, it's not live. You can cut it
Right.
out. So,
Right.
so we've done that, or you can have them re-record it. Say, "I just like to say that better." And sometimes, you don't even find that until you start to edit the podcast. And when you put it together, you go, "Oh, that didn't sound good." Or they made a mistake on one of the words and it sounds like something else. So we do what are called cut-ins, which is after we do a rough edit, if there's a mistake or something that we need a better transition, or we have to say something better, we may have one of the hosts or even a guest just call in and do a quick patch, a 15-second line to cover up that mistake. So yeah, that happens.
Oh. Thank you.
That's a good question, Janet. So, all right. Well, it's about a little bit late here. We better let everybody get back to work.
Okay.
And Rob, I want to thank you for joining us today, and this has been really informative. And hopefully, you'll visit us again soon.
Great.
Because we've got a lot of people that know it's going to be reaching out to you, and this has been a great subject. So, Janet, anything final words of wisdom for us?
No, it was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, let's make Kentucky the new podcasting hub of the country. So everybody, let's go start one.
All right, and thanks for the questions, Tony, as always.
You're more than welcome, as always.
Thanks for the opportunity, everybody.
Yep. Thanks for joining us today, everyone, and we'll see you next week. And have a good day today. We'll see you next time.